His name was Ka, and he had never once questioned a king. 30 years he had stood in that throne room, through wars, through famine. Through 2 assassination attempts he had personally stopped with his own hands. He had watched 3 pharaohs sit on that golden throne, and he had served them all without blinking. But tonight was different, torch flames burning dead still. Every window open. Ka, thick-armed, stone-faced, standing at the eastern pillar. His eyes are locked on something. A staff had just hit the marble floor. And now there was a snake, long, black, impossibly alive, moving toward Pharaoh's own serpent while the court magician scrambled backward in robes that suddenly meant nothing. Ka's hand drifted slowly toward his sword, then stopped, because Moses's serpent swallowed theirs whole. Ka's face, not showing fear, something worse, recognition. Like a man hearing a sound he has always known was coming. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, and Ka thought about his children at home. Have you ever been standing in a room, watching something happen, and you knew deep down that the world was about to change, but you said nothing? Ka said nothing. For 30 years, silence had kept him safe. But what happens when silence becomes the most dangerous choice of all? If this story is already pulling at something in you, subscribe and like the video right now. And drop in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Because you will want to be here for what comes next. Fountain in the palace courtyard had turned red by morning. Ka stood over it and said nothing. He just looked. The way a soldier looks at a wound, calculating the damage before letting himself feel it. Red water reflecting gold walls. Ka crouches beside the fountain, dips one finger in, pulls it back, stares at his fingertip. Something moves across his face, a man performing calm while something underneath is not calm at all. That same afternoon, he left the palace early. He told no one. He walked through streets that smelled like rust and river death, past market stalls packed up early, past women covering their water jars with cloth, past children who had stopped playing. He walked until he reached home. He stops at the door for a moment, just breathes. His wife met him in the doorway. Her eyes asked the question before her mouth did. "Wells," she said. Ka looked past her at his children eating at the table. His jaw tightened. "I stored water last week," he said quietly. "Enough for now." She studied his face. "You knew something was coming." He didn't answer, Ka carrying something heavy that has no name yet. Behind him, through the open door, the red horizon of a wounded city. He stepped inside and closed the door. But the question his wife asked that stayed outside with him, had he known? And if he had, why hadn't he spoken? Ka had escorted dangerous men into that throne room before. Assassins dressed as merchants. Rebels dressed as priests. He knew the look, the tight jaw, the calculating eyes, the body coiled like a rope about to snap. Moses had none of that. That was what unsettled Ka most. The man walked like the conversation was already over. Like he already knew the last line of a story nobody else had read yet. Pharaoh spoke first. Contempt wrapped in gold. "What is your God demanding now?" Moses answered without blinking. "The same thing he has always demanded. Let his people go," court murmured. A high priest laughed, the practiced laugh of a man performing confidence for an audience that needed reassurance. Ka did not laugh. The staff hit the marble. The crack echoed like a thunderclap in a cloudless sky. The serpent moved, long, black, impossibly alive, sliding toward Pharaoh's own serpent while the court magician scrambled backward in robes that suddenly meant nothing. Moses's serpent consumed theirs whole. Slowly, deliberately, as if making a point no amount of court magic could answer. Then the twist nobody expected. Pharaoh smiled, not the smile of a frightened man. The smile of a man who had quietly decided something dangerous and had no intention of telling anyone what it was. Ka caught it from the eastern pillar. His hand moved to his sword, then stopped. What had Pharaoh just decided? It happened at midnight. No warning, no thunder. One moment the Nile was dark and wide and ancient under the desert stars. The next, it was bleeding. By dawn the stench had reached the palace walls. Ka stood at the courtyard fountain, staring into water the color of an open wound, when a sound behind him stopped him cold. His second in command, a young soldier named Demi, was crying, not loudly, just standing at the fountain's edge, jaw clenched, tears running silently down his face. Ka had trained Demi himself. 8 years, battles, desert campaigns, 2 palace riots. He had never once seen the man break. "My son drank from the river last night," Demi said, "before it changed." Ka said nothing. "He's sick, Captain. Silence stretched between them like a held breath. 30 years of military discipline told Ka to say something firm, something that sounded like control. That was what captains did. They handed men a version of events that was bearable enough to keep moving forward. But Demi's boy was 7 years old. Ka turned without a word and walked back toward the palace. He passed the throne room doors standing open, Pharaoh visible on his throne in the distance. Alone. Watching the Red River through the far window, for the first time in 30 years, Ka kept walking. He went to find a physician instead. What kind of man stays loyal to power when that power is costing innocent people everything? Frogs first. Then gnats. Then flies so thick they moved like a single breathing shadow across the afternoon sky. Then the livestock dying on their feet in the fields, dropping without warning, without sound, as if something simply reached into their chests and switched the life off. Then boils. Then hail. And after every plague, after every fresh morning of ruin, Moses returned to those throne room steps. Same staff, same calm, same unbothered eyes. And every time Pharaoh listened, considered, and refused, Ka watched all of it from the eastern pillar. He watched the magicians stop coming, watched the advisors learn to stand further from the throne, watched the court perform confidence it had long stopped feeling. And he watched Demi, his second in command, the man whose son had drunk red water, show up every morning, armor on, face sealed, doing his job with the mechanical precision of a man who had packed his grief somewhere deep and locked it. Ka never asked about the boy. He was afraid of the answer. One afternoon, between the gnats and the flies, an Egyptian woman stopped at a Hebrew well. She had nothing left to carry water in. The Hebrew woman at the well looked at her for a long moment, then filled her jar without a word and handed it back. The Egyptian woman walked away without speaking. She did not say thank you. She was crying too hard. Ka saw it from the road. He told himself it meant nothing. But that night, for the first time in his adult life, Ka got down on his knees beside his sleeping children and stayed there a long time, doing something that had no military name and no tactical purpose, something that felt quietly and uncomfortably like prayer. After the hail, Pharaoh broke, not loudly, not dramatically. He simply called Moses back to the palace in the desperate, smoke-stained middle of the destruction. And when Moses arrived, what sat on the throne was not a performance. It was a man, exhausted, eyes stripped of everything rehearsed. "Stop this," Pharaoh said. His voice came out raw like something torn. "Whatever your God wants, I will give it. Take them. Go," Moses prayed. The storm stopped. The air cleared. The ground began to dry. And Ka, standing at his pillar, felt something strange move through the throne room, something that felt almost like relief, like a held breath finally released after months of pressure. He thought, "It is over." He was wrong, because in the hours that followed, in the quiet, restored calm of a morning without plague, Ka watched something happen to Pharaoh that was worse than rage, worse than cruelty. He watched the king remember who he was. The exhaustion left his face. The rawness sealed over. The posture straightened. And by afternoon, the word Pharaoh had spoken that morning, that honest, broken, costly word, was gone, quietly, completely, as if it had never been said at all. An advisor appeared at Ka's shoulder. "The king has changed his answer," he murmured. "Send word to Moses." Ka stared at the throne for a long moment. "You tell him," he said, and walked away. Pharaoh had every reason to let them go. He felt it. He said the word. And then, when the pressure lifted, he reached back and took it. Think about that for a moment. How many times have we made a promise to change, only to quietly take it back when the pain stopped? If this story is getting under your skin, type "still watching" in the comments right now. Subscribe and like the video so you don't miss what comes next, because Pharaoh is running out of chances, and Ka is running out of reasons to stay silent. While kings argued, the Hebrew people waited. And waiting, when you have been enslaved your entire life, requires a kind of faith most people will never be asked for. In the Hebrew settlement of Goshen, an old man named Elior sat outside his door every evening and watched the sky. Not anxiously, not desperately. The way a farmer watches for rain he has already decided is coming, patient, certain, unhurried. His granddaughter, Myra, sat beside him one night and pulled her knees to her chest. "Others are saying Moses has forgotten us," she said. "That nothing is changing." Elior was quiet for a moment. 400 years, he finally said. Our people waited 400 years, we have waited 40 days. Do not mistake slowness for silence, child. Mira stared at the dark horizon over Egypt. Somewhere out there, fires were still burning from the hail. The smell of it reached even Goshen. Are you afraid? She asked. The old man considered this honestly. Yes, he said, but fear and faith are not enemies. They live in the same chest. The question is which one you feed. Mira said nothing, just leaned into his shoulder. Above them the stars burned steady and indifferent. But in Goshen every lamp was lit, and somewhere in that warm, waiting light, something was building that no plague could touch and no Pharaoh could measure. Demi found Ka at the barracks wall just before dawn. He looked like a man who had not slept. His armor was on, but his eyes were somewhere else entirely. Fever broke, Demi said. Ka turned. The boy, last night. The physician said he turned a corner. Demi paused, his jaw working. I don't know why his fever broke when so many others didn't. I don't know what to do with that. Ka said nothing. He understood the weight of surviving something that took others. He had carried that weight himself after battles. It was not clean. It did not feel like victory. What are you going to do? Ka asked quietly. Demi looked at the ground. Keep serving. What else is there? Ka almost said. There might be something else. He almost said, I have been watching Moses and I cannot explain what I have seen. He almost said, last night I knelt beside my children and prayed to a God whose name I do not know, and something answered. He said none of it. He clapped Demi once on the shoulder. Get your armor straight, he said. Pharaoh reviews the guard at sunrise. They walked back together in silence. But the words Ka had swallowed stayed with him all day, sitting in his chest, heavier than anything he had ever carried into battle. 3 days, no sun. No lamp would hold its flame. It did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a decision, total, immediate, and suffocating. One moment Egypt existed. The next it simply disappeared inside itself. Ka had been on the palace steps when it happened. He stood perfectly still as the darkness pressed in from every direction at once, thick and deliberate, the kind of dark that made a man suddenly, privately aware of how small he actually was. He called out for his guards. Heard them answer, close, shaken, trying to sound professional about something that had no professional response. He found the wall with his hand and did not move. For 3 days, Ka sat in that darkness and had nothing to do but think. He thought about Demi's boy and the fever that broke when others did not. He thought about the Hebrew woman at the well who filled a stranger's jar without being asked. He thought about Elior, the old man he had once seen through a gate, sitting outside his door in Goshen, perfectly calm while Egypt collapsed around him. He thought, what does that man know that I do not? On the 3rd day, a thin line of light appeared over Goshen. Kai saw it from the palace wall, not sunlight. Something warmer, something that felt less like weather and more like an answer to a question he had not yet found the courage to ask out loud. What are you afraid of finding if you actually start looking for God? 3 days of darkness, and the only light came from the people Pharaoh refused to release. Think about that. Sometimes God removes everything we depend on not to destroy us, but to show us what was always there. If this story is reaching something real in you right now, type the word light in the comments. And if you want to follow this story all the way to its powerful ending, subscribe and like the video now. Because what happens next will change everything. For Ka, for Pharaoh, for 2 million people waiting in the dark. After the darkness, Pharaoh sent for Moses himself. No summons through a servant, no formal announcement. Just a soldier arriving at the Hebrew camp with a message stripped of all ceremony. The king wants to speak. Now, Ka delivered the message personally. He told himself it was protocol. He knew it was not. When Moses came to the gate, Ka met him there. They stood facing each other for a moment, the captain and the prophet, 2 men shaped by the same palace and completely different gods. He's going to say yes again, Ka said quietly. It was not a question. Moses studied him. What makes you say that? Because I know that man. I have served him 30 years. When he stops performing, when the room goes quiet and he sends for someone himself, he means it for a while. Moses looked at Ka for a long moment. Something moved across the prophet's face. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. Then why are you telling me? Moses asked. Ka had no clean answer. He stepped aside and let Moses through the gate. Inside, Pharaoh negotiated. Take the people, leave the livestock. Moses refused. The hardness returned to Pharaoh's face like a door swinging shut. He told Moses to leave and never return. Moses told him, "I will not come back. You will send for me." Ka heard both of them, and standing at that gate he finally understood this was never a negotiation between two men. It was a conversation between a king and the God he kept pretending did not exist. Moses gathered the people and told them exactly what God said, not approximately, not generally, exactly. Every detail carried weight. Every instruction had a reason, even when the reason was not yet visible. A lamb. Its blood painted on the doorposts. Unleavened bread eaten in haste. Sandals already on their feet. Staffs already in their hands. Eat like people who are not planning to sit down much longer. In the Hebrew settlement, families moved with quiet, deliberate purpose. The kind of purpose that only comes when people finally believe something is actually about to happen. Old Elior sat at his table and watched his granddaughter Myra braid the unleavened dough with steady hands. She had stopped asking whether Moses had forgotten them. She had stopped measuring the waiting. Something in the last few days had shifted inside her, the way ground shifts before a long-delayed rain finally arrives. "Are you ready?" Elior asked her. Myra looked at the painted doorpost, at the sandals on her feet, at the staff leaning against the wall, her grandfather's staff, the one he had carried for 40 years and never once used for walking. "I don't know what I'm ready for," she said honestly. Elior nodded. "Neither did Abraham, neither did Joseph. Readiness is not knowing what comes next, it is trusting who is leading." Mira was quiet for a long moment, then, "What about Ka, the soldier who has been watching us? What happens to him tonight?" Elior looked at the door. "That," he said carefully, "depends entirely on what he does with what he already knows." Outside, the night was perfectly still, and somewhere across the city, Ka was standing at his own door looking at his children, looking at the dark street, holding a question he could no longer avoid. Ka did not sleep. He had not planned to stay awake. He simply lay down beside his wife, stared at the ceiling, and felt the night pressing in around the house like something alive and deliberate. The way a storm presses before it breaks, except there was no storm. The sky outside was completely clear. The stars were out. The desert air was still. That stillness was the most frightening thing he had ever experienced. He rose quietly and stood in the doorway of his children's room, watched their small chests rising and falling in the lamplight. His daughter had her arm thrown over her brother the way she always slept, protective, unconscious, completely trusting. They had no idea what night this was. Then the sound arrived, not a crack, not a rush of wind, just a change. Something moving through the city at a depth that had nothing to do with weather or armies or anything Ka's 30 years of military experience had ever prepared him for. A presence. Vast, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. And then Egypt began to grieve, window by window, house by house. The sound that reached Ka was not screaming. It was something under screaming, something that came from a place in human beings that only opens when what is lost cannot be returned. Ka pressed his back against the doorframe of his children's room and did not move. His wife appeared beside him. She took his hand without speaking. Together they stood in the lamplight and listened to an entire nation learn grief all at once. Demi arrived at the door just before dawn, armor on, face destroyed. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was barely holding together. "My neighbor's household all night and mine nothing. My boy slept through all of it, Captain. Why us and not them?" Ka looked at his soldier for a long time. "I don't know," he said, "but I think it is time we found out who decides something like that." Pharaoh did not summon Moses to the throne room. He sent for him at dawn, in the courtyard. No guards announced. No ceremony prepared. No gold arranged to remind anyone who was in charge. Just a message carried by a single servant, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. Ka intercepted the servant at the gate. "Who sent you?" he asked. The servant looked at the ground. "The king, personally." Ka stood very still for a moment. Then he let the servant pass and followed at a distance, not as a guard, not as a soldier. As a man who needed to see what happened next with his own eyes, Moses arrived before sunrise. He walked through the courtyard gate the same way he always walked, unhurried, staff in hand, carrying the quiet authority of someone whose instructions came from higher than any palace wall. Pharaoh was already there, standing, not seated on anything, No throne, no elevation, no performance of power. Just a man in the gray early light, eyes red, the mask entirely gone. Ka stopped at the courtyard entrance and did not move. What he saw was not a king. It was something rarer and more devastating, a powerful man finally emptied of everything he had used to avoid this moment. The grief on Rames's face was not political, it was not strategic, it was the grief of a father, of a human being, of someone who had run completely out of road, Pharaoh said. The word came out broken, barely holding its shape. Take everything, all of them, go. Moses looked at him for a long, full moment. No triumph crossed his face, no satisfaction. Only the deep, heavy sorrow of a man who had spent months trying to prevent this outcome and had been refused at every turn. God go with you, Ramesses, Moses said quietly. I genuinely mean that. He turned toward the gate. Ka stepped aside to let him pass. As Moses walked by, he slowed just slightly and looked directly at Ka. Not a long look, just enough. Just enough to say, I saw you standing there. I always did. Ka watched Moses walk toward the rising sun and felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been sealed for 30 years under armor and loyalty and professional silence. He looked back at Pharaoh. The most powerful man in the world was standing alone in an empty courtyard, staring at a gate that had just become the last thing he would ever watch Moses walk through. What does it cost a man to finally surrender when he waits until there is nothing left to surrender for? Nobody ran. That was the first thing Ka noticed from the palace wall as the Hebrew people began to move. After everything, the plagues, the waiting, the grief, the long accumulated weight of 400 years, they did not run. They walked, deliberately, together, as if they had all silently agreed that this moment deserved to be felt, not fled. Ka stood at the wall and watched until the column stretched further than his eyes could follow. He found Demi beside him without remembering when the man had arrived. They stood together in silence for a long time. Thinking about going with them, Demi said. It was not an accusation. Just a soldier reading another soldier. Ka said nothing. I have been thinking about it too, Demi said quietly. Since the night my boy's fever broke, since the darkness, since last night. He paused. Since the morning you refused to carry Pharaoh's message back to Moses. Ka turned and looked at him. Demi met his eyes steadily. What are we still doing here, Captain? Below them, the Hebrew column kept moving. Men and women and children and elderly carried on carts, livestock, bundles of everything they owned, all of it moving toward a horizon that held more uncertainty than anyone could fully name. And yet not one of them looked back. Ka understood that. He understood it in his bones. He looked at Demi, then at the horizon, then back at Demi. Get your family, he said. We leave within the hour. Ka had built his entire life on one thing, not strength, not skill, not 30 years of unbroken service to the most powerful throne on earth. One thing, the belief that loyalty to a king was the highest a man could aim. That proximity to power meant proximity to safety. That if you served well enough, long enough, and silently enough, the world would hold together around you. Egypt had dismantled that belief one plague at a time. He walked out through the eastern gate with his wife on one side, his children ahead, Demi and his family just behind, and 2 million strangers surrounding him like a river that had finally found its direction. He carried nothing from the palace. No armor, no sword, no title. He had left all of it folded neatly at the base of the eastern pillar, the pillar he had stood beside for 30 years, watching a conversation between a king and a god, slowly understanding which one had always been in charge. His daughter looked up at him as they walked. Are you scared? She asked. Ka thought about the burning stillness on that final night. He thought about Moses walking through the courtyard gate with the quiet authority of a man carrying instructions from somewhere higher than any palace wall. He thought about Elior, the old man in Goshen who had waited his entire life for this morning and had never once stopped believing it was coming. Ka said honestly, but I am more afraid of going back than going forward. His daughter nodded seriously, as children do when they understand something completely without being able to explain it. They walked on. Behind them, Egypt stood silent, its monuments enormous, its throne empty, its river still healing. Ahead of them, the desert waited with no map and no promise except one. And that one promise, spoken from a burning bush to a stuttering shepherd in the middle of nowhere, had already proven itself more durable than the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh had spent his life building things that demanded to be seen. God had spent this story building something that simply could not be stopped. Ka spent 30 years standing in the right room and serving the wrong king. And yet God never stopped working on him. Through every plague, every silence, every word he swallowed, and every night he knelt beside his sleeping children and prayed to a God whose name he did not yet know. Here is what I want to ask you. What was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Was it Pharaoh taking back his word the moment the pressure lifted? Was it Ka finally saying, "Get your family, we leave within the hour"? Or was it something quieter, an old man telling his granddaughter that fear and faith live in the same chest? Share your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. And if this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that God is still working even in the seasons that feel like nothing is changing, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and like the video now, because the next story coming to this channel is one you will not see coming, and you do not want to miss it.